Hello and welcome back to Res Gaming and a new Elden Ring tier list. For this patch of 1.08, things have changed for a few different weapon types, and now we're finally talking about the boss weapons, those Remembrance boss weapons specifically. So here is the tier list. You might notice from last time something has changed. We no longer have an F tier because the only weapon in F is technically better this patch. However, unlike my other tier list, there are some boss weapons or Remembrance weapons that aren't good, so there is a D and a C for a reason. With that said though, let's jump into the list. Starting with bottom, the weapon that, used to be F, and now is a wonderful D. It's Bastard Stars, because flails have been buffed in 1.08, although weirdly in power stance specifically, but that's okay. Technically they're better, and so you can make use of them, especially in power stance, where in a recent build that Cotton did, ran the Bastard Stars flail in power stance with the bleed flail, which worked pretty damn well, especially in PvE, where the Bastard Stars buffed the Ash of War damage. Well, that was actually a lot more noticeable. They're undeniably better, so I must acknowledge that by bringing it up a tier. It's no longer an absolutely trash, terrible, unplayable weapon. It's now a playable weapon in a specific build, used in a specific way, more in PvE than PvP, and they definitely deserve some more love still to this day. It's very strange, but ultimately, I think D is a fair rating. Please keep buffing them. Alright, with that said, now it's time for the Winged Greathorn, also in D tier. Keeping this here, despite it having multiple improvements in previous patches, it did get a target buff to improve the Ash Soul Stifler by extending the effect time, but it's just not relevant in any way. That only really works in PvE, and that's where it's just kind of like fine as a weapon. This one just does not really work in PvP. You're never going to hit that Ash, you're never going to get the benefit of it. To me, I feel like the cloud shouldn't be something you simply place, but it should hone in on a target you're locked on. The cloud is way too small and just doesn't really affect the enemies in the way that it should. So D tier still for me, this one. But that is now the end of D tier, because a weapon that used to be D tier is now C in 1.08. We're talking about the Grafted Dragon, the fist weapons, which as a weapon type were specifically buffed in multiple ways. Mainly, you're getting more attacks out, and the poise damage of these has gone up greatly. They're undeniably better, and I've been running fist weapons recently with a different build. It has that unique Ash of War where you're blasting everything with fire in an AoE. Bear Witness does work in certain fights, actually works quite well in Melania's fight, but even in the scenario where, you're not got the target of the attention on you, say in the arena, it's still quite hard to land that in PvP. There isn't as much oomph to this weapon as I would like, so while I bring it up from the very low level of D to C, I just don't think the output of this thing is that reliable or good, and it's still something you will rarely ever see. Much like the Axe of Godrick, which I still really dislike, despite its improvements back in 1.06. It does have a more unique actual axe moveset, as I've always talked about. I like that. It also has one of the unique aspects to its Ash of War where you can feint by rolling out of it when you want to, saving on FP and also not getting stuck in it, which can be amazing in both PvE and PvP, where you don't want to get stuck in that animation because you used it at the wrong time. It just isn't that strong in terms of output potential, and now you can technically use it, but it's incredibly rare to see it because it's just not popular because it's got very low power. Still, at least it's functional now, like I said before. Also a functional pick, but not an amazing pick, is the Giant's Red Braid. As a fire whip, it has the fun whip moveset, which has some really good range, especially the running or jumping attacks. But much like the Grafted Dragon, there is literally better alternatives. There is a bleed whip, which does the same thing, but will deal much more damage, and of course, proc bleed, which is huge in both PvE and PvP. Here, fire is obviously good in a lot of content in the game. Fire will even hard CC some enemies, so it's a good pick for that reason. And the Ash of War really holds you in place, which is just a negative thing. I would love to see the weapon type of whips be improved in some way in the future. Last up in C tier then is the bow, the only ranged weapon on the list really. The Lion's Great Bow is Radahn's bow, and it is a solid great bow to pick up and play, honestly, from the moment that you get it. Compared to other great bows, it has good scaling, and it comes pre-equipped with the very powerful Rain of Arrows Ash of War, arguably the best thing you can run for AoEing down and damaging DPSing big enemies like the dragons. Also, it uniquely benefits from the Radahn great bows, dealing high damage per shot, so it's actually a solid great bow option, but great bows aren't that good, so I leave it at a C tier once again because it's had no changes as well. All right, jumping up to B tier, where we have two weapons that have had some very important changes this patch. Firstly, we're talking about the Dragon King's Crag Blade, which is a heavy thrusting weapon, and it's down from an A tier to a B tier in this patch. It's very hard to ignore that this weapon type has been target nerfed in many ways. PvP specifically, thrusting damage and counterattack damage has been reduced, which is the basis of the base damage of this weapon, especially in PvP, so that's a huge negative. But heavy thrusting swords were attacked in other ways too. In fact, they have much lower poise damage. Heavy thrusting swords were singled out to deal less poise damage, so they're much harder to work in PvP in trade, where they were a little bit too strong admittedly. They've also reduced the speed of heavy thrusting sword crouch attacks and the double-handed thrusting jumping attack of these heavy thrusting swords. So less poise, less counterattack damage, and less power on some of their most powerful attacks. Undeniably, this has taken a hit this patch, and that's why I bring it down to a B tier. I actually still think they're good, especially the bleed one, Bloody Hellis. They're very strong, they just were a bit brokenly good, but contextually, I have to bring it down a peg because it was nerfed in such an aggressive way. Next then, we have Marika's Hammer, which was previously a B tier and still a B tier, despite being improved significantly this patch. There were major hammer buffs in 1.07 to the poise damage that you can deal, and further in 1.08. Hammers as a weapon type had improved speed of attacks. Distance of attacks was a big deal, and better recovery as well. Further, when two-handing a hammer, you now have much more poise. So it's just been improved in that specific way pretty aggressively in a patch where poise is so important. I ran a recent build where we're running a bleed hammer, and actually it worked fairly well, becoming a viable weapon type. And when we look at Marika's Hammer again, there's no bleed damage there, which was kind of carrying in a big way as follow-up damage with the build that I was talking about. However, this one does have a very impactful, very powerful Ash of War, which was buffed in previous patches multiple ways. They improved the damage of it, and of course the speed of it in a patch a while back, making it a very good option in both PvE and PvP because of the hyper armor, because of the damage, because of the AoE range that it has. But we cannot deny this weapon type is still quite weak and not meta relevant. It's just a lot more viable than it once was, and certainly worthy still of B tier because of that. Okay, this brings us up to A tier, where we're going to begin with the Sacred Relic Sword, which is still A tier, but technically better this patch. Just, you know, specifically in this patch due to the arena, in free-for-all or team fights where you don't have the full attention on you, so the massive range of that Ash of War is obviously very funny and very effective, dealing great damage, knocking people down, and the range, the AoE, the width of the attack is just so silly, but it hasn't really changed in any way this patch other than that, you know, to bring it up a tier in any way. It's just better in those specific modes where it's quite impactful. As a weapon then, it remains an A tier, very good pick, but not brokenly strong, like I believe some of these S tier picks will be. I also want to talk about another weapon that's not actually changed this patch majorly, but has had some slight improvements. It's the Star Scourge Greatswords here, which are better this patch due to it being more impactful, say, in the arena, where again we have that AoE power, and if you're in a free-for-all or team deathmatch, you can catch people out. The animation may take a while, but if they're in a corner or they're distracted or two people are dueling, you just walk in and do the scream and blast. That can obviously be very effective. So in those modes, it's technically pretty relevant, pretty useful there. And the crouch poke of colossal weapons has been improved this patch. While you can't normally crouch poke when you're using both of them, you can two-hand just one of them and then be able to crouch poke and get those benefits. It's not broken like it used to be, but it is better, and so that is relevant here. But in general, colossal swords are a big, slower, heavy-hitting weapon type, and they've generally made those slower, heavier-hitting weapons more effective in terms of poise, which again is very important this patch. So I just have to highlight these ways that contextually this weapon is better, but again, it doesn't bring it to an S tier. It's just better slightly this patch. Next, a quick word on the Axe of Godfrey, which I brought up to an A tier in the previous list because of the incredible improvements this weapon has had in the previous patches, most importantly in the last one. We've got super high AR that you can buff up with the Warcry, the Colossal moveset buffs in general with the Poise. The Ash is now working with the Beast Roar Talisman, so it actually does a massive amount of damage when you actually land it, and they've made the follow-up attack combo after you're buffed up with that Warcry and slam the Regal Roar draw, well, that's really quick, at least on the first part, which is incredible for trading in PvP, and pretty much entirely something you can rely on in PvE. It's not S tier though, because there are many aspects of this weapon that aren't good, still very slow, such as the follow-up R2 of that super fast combo. It's mega slow. You're kind of relying on certain aspects of the weapon and its moveset and ignoring the rest, which is why it works and why it's actually quite good where you use that. Still, it used to be not viable at all, and now it's damn good. So yeah, A tier. Also in A tier, still keeping it there, is Morgott's Cursed Sword, which was buffed both in 1.04 and 1.06. The Ash of War, the basic moveset, the curved greatswords, these have all been improved significantly over time. You just have a lot more oomph and power behind it. The Ash of War had its cast speed increased, the recovery time improved so you can combo really well, and they improved the speed of heavy attacks and charge attacks when two-handing specifically for the curved greatsword moveset. This brought the weapon up pretty well, and it's also got bleed as an arcane weapon, and that's obviously great. Then there's the cursed blood effect of the Ash of War, so there's fire damage there, which is relevant in certain areas of PvE. You can trade pretty well by just spamming that Ash of War, or just kill bosses with it. So it's an all-rounder weapon that's very good. It might not hit as hard as other weapons, but it has the potential to burst and combo, which it didn't previously have, which is why I brought it up to an A tier. But there aren't really any major changes for it in this patch, so it stays there. Alright, last up for A tier is still the Hand of Malenia, which I do really like as a katana. It's about as long as the washing pole, the Nagakiba. It has some base bleed with it, and reasonable scaling for your decks. And also the Waterfall Dance, which can be incredible in both PvE and PvP if you can land the combo, because you can be knocked out of it. Maybe some heavy armor, maybe some poised talismans will allow for that, obviously. The problem is it's still worse in every way than the Nagakiba as a base weapon, and there was also a hit to the counter thrust damage that is there on some of its attacks in PvP, as well as reducing the poise on katanas specifically. So it's still an A tier pick, but a fairly lower one, I would say, because of these changes. Still, it is one of the coolest weapons in the game. The Ash of War is insane, and I really like this weapon in general. Alright, we are now at S tier though, with the last 4 weapons. First up, Mohgywn's Sacred Spear, which remains really good despite its nerf in the previous patch, where they made the AoE range of the Ash of War smaller, but it's still very large and has a really good effect and works really well in the arena where AoE and that kind of thing is fantastic. Not only is it a big AoE, which works great in that context, but obviously it's the bleed, which is insane. Then when you're buffed up with the Cursed Blood, you have fire and bleed effect on the base weapon damage, and it's a great spear, which is honestly phenomenal with the range, with the damage, with the stagger and poise capabilities in this patch. I absolutely love using this thing. I never have a bad time with it. It is still an S tier pick, even if it was slightly nerfed, but not in a relevant way in my opinion. Also better this patch, somehow, is the Blasphemous Blade, this stupid thing, this overtuned weapon with all of its passives, the lifesteal, the kill lifesteal, the fire damage, and the Ash of War, which is ridiculous, and that's where it's technically better this patch, because again, in free-for-all arena or team deathmatch, if people aren't paying attention to you, having a long-range AoE Ash of War is obviously phenomenal, and that is exactly what this is. It's actually very wide, wider than it appears, so it's very easy to land, and you can just stand on the side, spamming that, claiming your kills, dealing damage, and again, helping your team in the team setting really effectively. It's just basically the best boss weapon in the game and always has been since patch 1.0, but it's only got better with various greatsword buffs and obviously the contextual improvements like the arena with the Ash of War. So yeah, obviously S tier pick. Now last time I brought up a weapon from A tier to S tier as a boss weapon specifically, and that's Maliketh's Black Blade here. This was due to the Destined Death buffs, which yeah, it now lasts a full minute, which is incredible, leading to easier stacking of that special effect where you've got 10% reduction on the enemy, you got damage over time, and the damage that it deals on hit. This Ash of War also has really good hyper armor, making it incredible for trading, and it hits really hard with high poise damage because it's a colossal sword. And again, the crouch poke was improved in this patch, so it's technically better this patch further. It's a heavy hitting colossal sword that has just steadily got better over time in the previous patches and the current patch yet again. So it's one of my favorite boss weapons in the game, but undeniably one of the most effective as well in the current patch. Last but not least then, for S tier, it is still the Carian Regal Scepter, which is technically a weapon and a Remembrance boss weapon at that, because you do have its own like spinning weapon Ash of War in it, and it has the passive benefit of giving you the full moon, of buffing up the full moon sorceries, which we actually had a look at recently. It turns out those moon, like the dark moon or full moon sorceries, they also work like a black hole to draw in enemy sorceries. I always thought that only worked when collided by coincidence, but no, it does work like a black hole, sucking in even like the star sorceries. And on top of all of that, it is an S scaling int weapon, the best in the game, unless you're willing to spend more FP per spell cast. But if not, it's your best option. So obviously it deserves to be S tier because it's pretty much the best or second best staff in the game. But there you have it. That is our complete list for your boss weapons, your remembrance weapons in patch 1.08. I've just organized things as always in each individual tier, so the strongest is on the left and the weakest is on the right. I'm happy to see weapons like the flails get slight improvements, but yeah, needs a lot more love. But we no longer have an F tier weapon, and that is a good thing. Let me know your thoughts on the list though, if there's anything you'd change or reorganize at all. But for now, I've been Hollow, you've been you. This has been our boss weapons of 1.08. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.